Back in November 2001, Microsoft jumped into the console market and released one of the best consoles of all time, the original Xbox. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the original Xbox was one console that basically came out of nowhere from the grasps of one of the biggest companies in the world to basically infiltrate a market dominated by the Japanese, Nintendo and PlayStation. And you know what they did? They won. They succeeded. They actually cracked into one of the most competitive markets imaginable. Now, when I talk about the original Xbox, I'm talking about the system that had the very, very amazing green, kind of cyberpunky style whenever you fired up that system, a console that came with some of the most beastly specifications at the time, hard drives, and popularized online centralized gaming, okay? It wasn't that gaming didn't touch the internet. The PlayStation 2 was online. In some capacity, I'm pretty sure GameCube had a network adapter. Heck, Nintendo had online gaming with the Super Nintendo. And let's not get started on the Dreamcast, but the Xbox with Xbox Live allowed tons of people around the world, the country, to come together and play games like Halo 2 online. It popularized an entire slew of gamers to be part of one of the most toxic online communities. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen? Gaming was like different back then, okay? It was like a different total time. People would line up to stores, pick up these games, pick up copies of Halo 3, Call of Duty 4, you name it, and just go home and play with the boys and the girls and everyone imaginable. Now, of course, while the original Xbox wasn't necessarily the biggest sales juggernaut, it was definitely a system that felt different to play. You know, if you played a game like Splinter Cell back in the day, versus the PlayStation 2, which is where I initially played it, or the Xbox, the versions would literally be different, because Microsoft released one of the most impressive gaming systems on the market, a system that genuinely felt amazing to play, a system that had graphics that would absolutely eclipse its competition. And you could feel it when you played it at a demo kiosk at a Best Buy or a Walmart, or you went to your friend's house and actually played a game that played at double the frame rate with enhanced graphical effects. It really felt different. Then, of course, Microsoft released one of my favorite consoles of all time, the Xbox 360. Now, the Xbox 360 is a system that I will never forget. It's a system where I loaded up Halo 3 for the first time, connected two controllers, and played Halo 3's campaign split screen with my brother. I played it over Xbox Live with my friends, and it brought me into a whole slew of console exclusives from Xbox that have such a profound impact on my gaming history. When I talk about games like Gears of War 1, 2, and 3, these are games that have carried me through high school. They have carried me through friendships, and they are games that I have fond memories of. When I think about games like Forza and Forza Horizon, when I think of Splinter Cell Conviction, and I think of numerous Xbox 360 games that stand the test of time, this was a gaming console that Microsoft released a year ahead of their competitor, and they absolutely got that killer advantage. And if you talk about any console that would solidify anyone's place in history, it would be the Xbox 360. But of course, all good things come to an fucking end, because Microsoft released what was in fact the Xbox One and revealed it with the worst possible thing imaginable. Price is Right was a core feature of that console generation, and in this moment, 10 years ago, Microsoft handed the reins of console leadership over to their competition immediately, when they would promote televisions and movies as the core feature offering, far more involved than video games. It was a system where this guy ended up actually ruining the Xbox brand by making dumbass statements like this.
On for games.
Yeah,
and I think people are going to love it, and then they're going to understand what we're trying to create and how it links games and entertainment, the functionality of the box, some of the advantages that you get of having a box that is designed to use an online state. So that, to me, is a future-proof choice, and I think people could have arguably gone the other way if we didn't do it, and fortunately we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360. That's your message. If you don't, like it.
If you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device. I mean, seriously.
Now, of course, this was the scummy response to when people rightfully were mad about Xbox One's forced online connectivity. But of course, times have changed, and I'm pretty sure the remaining Xbox crowd that still loves this console would probably defend this to this day. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, this was the turning point between Xbox being dominant and Xbox stagnating into the position it's in now. Now, the Xbox Series S and X are the current console offerings, and Microsoft isn't necessarily doing too well. In fact, they're actually going through a lot of layoffs. Now, before we continue into this, I want to say that layoffs are kind of happening all throughout the world right now. It's not just the gaming industry, it's the world in general. But may I remind you, Microsoft is one of the largest companies in the world. So this is Microsoft's current market cap, $3.057 trillion, making them larger than Apple, Nvidia, Google, Amazon, and Saudi Aramco. If any company has deep pockets, it is in fact Microsoft as a company. They don't just make crazy money on Xbox. In fact, Xbox used to just be a rounding error. In fact, it was a rounding error until effectively Microsoft ended up buying some of the biggest studios in the world. For instance, Microsoft bought Bethesda or ZeniMax for $7.5 billion. And this is an important metric to consider today. They bought this entire set of companies for $7.5 billion. In fact, they even bought Activision Blizzard for $75.4 billion US dollars, which effectively makes Microsoft a pretty serious blip for Microsoft's bean counters at this point, right? Remember, Xbox used to be a rounding error. They never really made a lot of money, nor did they lose enough money ever. It was just something that they had under their umbrella the entire time. And it was propped up by Microsoft's other ventures like Office, Teams, and of course, their Windows operating systems. See, Microsoft is in the business of subscription services. Nearly everything Microsoft offers is a subscription, whether you buy Windows or subscribe to Windows at this point, whether you subscribe to Office or Xbox Game Pass, you are in a plethora of subscription hell when it comes to this company. And that's pretty much the direction they feel they have to go. Now, of course, because Microsoft bought ZeniMax, people had thought, well, maybe the company is going to be propped up with that sweet, sweet Microsoft money. No, because Tango Gameworks, about a day ago, pretty much said, today it's announced that Tango Gameworks will close. Thank you for everyone that explored the worlds we created. Hi-Fi Rush, along with Tango's previous titles, will remain available and playable everywhere they are today. Now, it's actually kind of funny how during the same day, the other Microsoft marketing division ended up releasing a controller that said, "Feel the burn today." Now, I don't want to shit on anybody in the marketing sphere because these departments oftentimes have no idea what the hell is going on. I just thought it was a hilarious coincidence. That said, though, one of Microsoft's acquisitions, one of their most prized acquisitions, and one they absolutely praised, ended up being shuttered down. Now, to give you an idea, this information cuts so deep for me, and it's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video. One of my favorite games that Tango Gameworks has ever made is Ghostwire Tokyo, a game that I absolutely poured my hours into, 100%ed, and absolutely loved. It's not a game that is super impressive by any metrics, but it's a game that allows you to explore the supernatural version of Tokyo where everything has disappeared, and it deeply goes into Japanese folklore where you're fighting yokais, and there's side quests, there's a campaign, there's just a whole lot of exploration, and it's one of those games you kind of play when you want to almost turn your brain off and just do a whole bunch of checklisty stuff. In some way, this game feels like an original Xbox 360 title from that era, but brought up just enough so that it actually melds with current modern day AAA standards. And now, this game probably didn't do so well, but it did end up getting free updates down the road too, where they ended up adding a roguelike mode, which is actually really awesome, and of course, new features and whatnot. Now, Tango Gameworks also made the other franchise known as The Evil Within, which people really do enjoy, Evil Within 1 and 2. But one game franchise they absolutely have made that has blown people away is Hi-Fi Rush, which actually won awards and pretty much was one of the games that people had brought up as Microsoft's big wins of last year. Now, while I wasn't the biggest fan of Hi-Fi Rush, to give you an idea, Phil Spencer, the current acting boss from my understanding of Microsoft, had this shit to say a year ago on the Kinda Funny Games podcast.
But one thing I won't do is push against creative aspirations of our teams. I know a lot of people will say, hey, you've got teams know how to do one kind of game, just force them to go do the one kind of game that they have a proven track record for. And I'm just not a believer in that. Maybe that means I'll underdeliver for some of our fans out there. But when a team like Rare wants to do Sea of Thieves, when a team like Obsidian wants to do Grounded, when Tango wants to go do Hi-Fi, when everybody probably thought they were doing Evil Within 3. I want to give the teams the creative platform to go and push their ability, push their aspirations.
So yeah, all this guy does is goddamn yap and not actually amount to anything. Microsoft even pretty much had went out, again, this was Aaron Greenberg, who actually ended up saying Hi-Fi Rush was a breakout hit for us and our players in all key measurements and expectations. We couldn't be happier with what the team at Tango Gameworks delivered with this surprise release. So again, on one breath, they're talking about, again, creatively fostering all of these companies they bought to succeed. And hey, this one game studio, Tango, had made a absolute breakout hit for us. And then of course, what do they do next? Shut the fucking studio down. And they didn't just shut this studio down. Microsoft announced 4 other studios being shut down as well. One of them was Arcane Austin as well. You know what Arcane Austin made, by the way, that was absolutely impressive? It was a game known as Prey. Now, Prey is, for anybody that's played System Shock or Bioshock, is an immersive sim game similar to that, where, again, it's an immersive shooter. If you played a game where there's a lot of, I guess, first-person style Metroidvania, where you got to keep backtracking, upgrade your abilities, fight against enemies, it is literally that game. It is an amazing title that, you know, was released. People didn't jump into it and buy it. It wasn't like a massive seller from my understanding. It wasn't like super huge, but it was a game that was critically acclaimed, well loved. And again, this studio had to be shut down because Microsoft is in a situation where I really feel like they have no idea what to actually do with their brand anymore. Ever since Microsoft bought some of the biggest companies in gaming and some of the biggest brands like Call of Duty, it's basically become a situation in Microsoft where they actually, I think, have no idea of what to promote for a lot of their games. Do they promote Halo? Do they promote Call of Duty? Do they promote any of these big brands? It's seriously confusing to be at Microsoft. Whereas Nintendo and Sony have like actual release schedules for a lot of these big games where they actually treat them pretty equally. For instance, if they're releasing God of War Ragnarok, they give that the same amount, from my understanding, of promotion and attention as when they release games that aren't necessarily as huge as Death Stranding, for instance, right? Where again, they have a tentative release cycle, they release games and they call it a day. How many upcoming Xbox releases do you fucking hear of? If Sony puts out big billboards for games like Spider-Man 2, Microsoft will never advertise anything like Hellblade 2, for instance, which comes out the 21st of this month, without anything so much more so than a tweet. You probably haven't even seen actual ads on YouTube of this game. It is 2 weeks out, and it almost feels like this would have slipped by. The only reason I know about this is because at the back of my head, something asked me, hey Muda, what about that new Hellblade game you saw around the beginning of the Xbox life cycle? Maybe you should Google that up. It was by actual happenstance that I decided to look this game up. It wasn't being advertised or marketed, if anything. So if this game fails to succeed, I would be hard-pressed if Microsoft would go out and say, gamers just aren't interested in this kind of shit. They literally do such a bad job of promoting their own video games that people have to look through and basically be Mandela affected and go through an entire process to figure out if this game is actually coming out, did it come out, or whatnot, before they finally have to look up release dates for themselves. Their competitors will blow your face out with upcoming games and advertisements for them. Microsoft, I feel like they do absolutely nothing. And it's not just the games that are releasing that are a little bit on the indie side. Microsoft does an absolutely poor job with their actual mainline AAA games. I'm going to keep going back to Halo Infinite as an example. Right now, after a slew of updates, Halo Infinite is a somewhat decent game. But when that game initially released, Microsoft dropped the ball by releasing an unfinished title. It was a game that dropped with its multiplayer incomplete, by the way, too. You know, if you look into the past with Microsoft releases, when they dropped games like Halo Reach, there were huge promotional campaigns for it. The game dropped in a completed state. You had a game that had a campaign, a game that had its firefight mode, the multiplayer mode, custom games, Forge, all 5 of these could be entire games in of themselves. And now that they release games like Halo Infinite, one of their biggest releases ever on the most powerful systems, it's a game that lacks split screen on launch, a campaign that isn't accessible at launch, no firefight mode from my understanding to this day, which is absolutely mind-boggling when it's a huge core feature of actual Halo games, no Forge on release, and the custom games option was incredibly limited. And the multiplayer that was there was relegated to a few game modes versus the slew of game modes that was introduced in Halo 3 and Halo Reach and even Halo 4. So again, their big landmark title, they dropped the ball on. And let's not even start talking about games like Gears of War that have pretty much remained anonymous as far as this entire generation has gone on. Now, one individual known as Brad Hilderberg, who was apparently an ex-Microsoft EA guy, apparently had started talking about why some of those Bethesda studios had been shut down. So he says there are 2 reasons why all those Bethesda studios closed, and neither of them have anything to do with Bethesda directly. Game Pass and Activision. The biggest paradox with Game Pass is that basically every game that launches on the service badly misses its sales goal. Makes sense though. Why pay full price to buy a game when you can play it for free as part of your subscription? This I absolutely agree with. A lot of these big games that come out and the independent stuff like Hi-Fi Rush, the sales numbers are always badly misfigured. Because who in most cases is going to buy an entire game versus just buy the subscription service and play games instead? I can't actually remember the last time I personally have actually bought an actual Xbox game. Since they don't even care about the physical releases anymore, I don't even feel the need to go out and buy a disc or digitally purchase these games, especially when I can pay less money and get access to playing some of these mediocre titles for, again, a fraction of the cost. Games like Starfield, which I guess are billed as some of the biggest Xbox single-player releases, when effectively they're just Fallout 4 in space, is a game that I don't believe I should have paid full price for. I should have just played this on the subscription service and called it a day. It's a game that I haven't even finished in that capacity. But going back to this post, this is accounted for somewhat by attributing portions of revenue to top-performing Game Pass games every month. But there are factors working against games, namely the fact that most games don't stay at the top of the chart for more than a month or 2, and also that Game Pass growth has stagnated. So games like Hi-Fi Rush, which is incredible mind you, get a very small bump in revenue from being the hot Game Pass game for a month. Then it falls off a cliff when everyone moves on to the next thing. Poor Redfall had it even worse since it launched so rough. It never had a chance. The system was fine for a while when Game Pass was growing like gangbusters, but now it's slowed down and the amount of revenue it's attributing to games isn't keeping up with the budgets to make them. And this is actually true as well. The amount of growth that some of these actual gaming subscriptions, and it's not just Game Pass, it's PlayStation Now as well, have seen a growth of about 1% at this point, as of recently. So it's not exactly growing to the point that it used to be, and that is not good. It means that the money that they are making and the growth of it and the expectation that that money will pay back the development cost for some of these games is becoming a house of cards that's slowly on its way out. So again, all of that wouldn't have mattered 3 or 4 years ago because back then, Xbox was basically a rounding error on Microsoft's books. The division made some money, but more importantly, it didn't cost that much, and other parts of the business easily covered the gap. Then Xbox went on a buying spree and spent a lot of money on Bethesda, but orders of magnitude more on Activision. Now the Eye of Sauron has turned and Xbox is expected to make back that $70 billion, or at least cut expenses to the bone while they try. And that brings us back to Game Pass. So far, the big bets on driving new subscriptions, Redfield, Starfield, haven't spurred near enough growth, and there's not much on the horizon that is likely to restart the momentum. The best bet is Call of Duty. But do you really risk the guaranteed sales revenue that franchise brings by putting it on Game Pass on day one and potentially lose massive sales? I don't know what the plans are, but either you put it on Game Pass and lose money, or you don't and the subscribers revolt because they think that's what they signed up for. COD will be fine though, as well as the other mega studios with huge IPs. But you're seeing the impact. All the smaller studios really making interesting games are going to fall away, simply because as good as games like Hi-Fi Rush are, they're never going to somehow make enough money to make up the $70 billion hole that Xbox now has to dig out of itself. And that is by far one of the best analyses in this situation. It's not necessarily the big games that are going to be paying for it. Look, Call of Duty will always survive. The thing about putting Call of Duty on a subscription service is ultimately a bad thing for business. Why make it where a game franchise that actually makes billions of dollars a year at this point, why actually take away a guaranteed source of income? It's kind of like putting Grand Theft Auto on a subscription service. Why put Grand Theft Auto 5 on a subscription service when in reality Grand Theft Auto 5 still to this day makes a lot of sales? It's one of the reasons why live service gaming is this weird dragon that companies keep on trying to chase. I feel like with many big Microsoft games, especially games that have a multiplayer component, Microsoft is trying to find the next big actual live service game. And if you think about the industry like this, live service games are successful, at least the ones that are mostly played in the top 10. If you look at some of the top 10 most online played games, they are not new games. They're games like Fortnite, which have been out for years. They're games like Rainbow Six Siege, which have been out for years. They're games like Grand Theft Auto 5 that actually have no competition. And while game companies try to chase that one game that can net $1 billion a year, the only thing, for example, that will kill Grand Theft Auto 5 is Grand Theft Auto 6. And again, it's kind of a shame when companies look at those metrics and think, let's just make the next big live service game. Because here's the thing, for every one successful Grand Theft Auto 5 live service, there are at least 30 failures to look at in the industry. And that's something that Microsoft and nobody else is truly figuring out. We literally just have Suicide Squad with a $200 million hole in Warner Brothers' pockets. It's insanity. Now, the only people that are actually paying for this are those smaller developers. Look, I don't give a shit about Halo at this point, but I do give a shit about Ghostwire Tokyo. And I was really looking forward to a Ghostwire Tokyo 2 at some point in my gaming life. But because of Microsoft's poor business decisions and the fact that they just like to gobble up companies and literally do nothing with them, instead shut them down when that's how their business is going, is ultimately a net negative for gamers. Look, people have always said, Muda, is this going to be a video game crash? I really do believe a video game crash will come, but for a very specific AAA market of games that have highly bloated budgets and games that are trying to chase that weird live service dragon. Look, as bad as gaming appears on the surface and in the news, there is ultimately a silver lining to a lot of this. There are a lot of games that are successful that actually make gangbuster levels of cash. You've got games like System Shock, that the remake alone is one of the best games that I've played. Even on Steam, the amount of indie offerings is wild. I recently started playing a game called Mullet Jack, which is just this roguelike first-person shooter. It was made by a few people, if not just one person, and it's a game that I feel can make a lot of money back if people just give this a chance and give it a try. Games like V Rising come out literally today. Games like Hades 2 in early access that are still killing it right now, positively reviewed, actually making money. It really feels like if you're a game public or game developer, never ever sell your team for financial security at any of these big companies. Because if the largest company on the planet, Microsoft, can't prop up the things that they've bought, then that's just a shame to not just them, but the livelihoods of the people that they brought onto their company. That is a fucking shame, and it's something that I honestly am really offended of that Microsoft started to do. Look, I want Xbox to succeed, not because I have a history with them, but because competition is important. I don't want one of the largest sectors, one of the biggest pillars of gaming to fall because of some of the poorest decision making at Microsoft and some of the poor business handling of people like Phil Spencer, who's somebody I believe is a lying sack of shit. I don't believe anything Phil Spencer says is actually for the good of gamers. I think that he likes to yap a whole lot, make parasocial relationships, but when it comes to topics like game preservation, making sure that gamers are actually satiated and gamers are actually getting the games that they want from the companies Microsoft has acquired, I don't believe he has good intentions at heart. I think he is by far one of the fucking worst businessmen to exist in gaming and one of the worst people, one of the worst influences on the Xbox brand. But yeah, this is where Xbox is, and there's a whole lot to talk about. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave it right here. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike if you dislike it. I am out.